Welcome back to another episode of the College 12 Pack. I'm your host, Tyler Natuno, and with me, as always, Duke Wire Managing Editor Ryan Haley. Now, if you've been keeping up with us here on the College 12 Pack for the last month or two, we've really been kind of going deep dive and previewing the 2024 season, going conference by conference through the Power Four. We previewed the Group of Five, and then last week we talked about everyone's favorite topic, which is the hot seat, and kind of previewed which coaches find themselves under some pressure going into the 2024 season. And now, we're pretty close to that light at the end of the tunnel. Next time you hear from us, we'll be previewing actual college football games. So as we sort of wrap up our off-season content schedule here this week, I feel like there's nothing really more fitting to talk about than the biggest change we're going to see in college football this season, which is the expanded college football playoff. Going to be 12 teams this year, obviously. The four highest ranked power conference champions guaranteed top four seeds, group of five spot guaranteed. So a lot of changes, and we're going to just kind of have to see how all this operates the first time through. But what we wanted to do today was kind of run through what our predicted fields are, and ultimately, put some accountability for ourselves out there, make some hard predictions about what we think is going to happen running through round by round. And we're going to give you a national championship pick here today. But to start things off, kind of wanted to get more into the narrative side of things. And so we're going to start off by talking about which teams that we see as a lock. Like they are, there's no chance they're missing the field this year. So I'll let you kick off this discussion, Ryan. Who do you got?
Yeah, thank you, Tyler, for that wonderful setup. I tried to go, I didn't take, there's an obvious one that I think that you have after me. But I went with the Oregon Ducks. And Dylan Gabriel now taking over at quarterback. And if you look at this is one of the most talented teams in the country. I think every website that has done a NCAA football 25 simulation is like Oregon makes the playoff more than anybody else, and it's not close. Oregon wins the most national championships, and it's not close. And it makes sense when you consider the talent they had on offense last year. Running back, receiver, the offensive system they run. Dylan Gabriel's really experienced and can rack up yards. But if you look at their schedule, they play Ohio State and Michigan, who we'll talk more about both of those teams later on throughout this episode. But even worst case scenario for both of them will be an absolute nightmare. And the third hardest team on the schedule is either a rebuilding Washington, Boise State, or Luke Fickell's Wisconsin. That's like the three options you have. Like, what's the third hardest game on Oregon's schedule? And now with, like it or not, 6 at-large bids available. Obviously, the Pac-12 dissolving is kind of made it really clean of like 4 conference champions, 4 auto bids, and then 1 group of 5 team. But everybody else is going to be an at-large team. And I think Oregon, if they look impressive and they match the statistical output they had last year, can still make the playoff at 10-2. As long as they don't get blown out by both Ohio State and Michigan. If they lose both games by 10 points or less, or if they take one to overtime and lose the other one by 10, I think they go even if they don't beat anybody else impressive.
Yeah, for sure. And I think there's a good reason that Oregon is getting that kind of attention because and maybe I'm guilty of it too, because I've done a lot of hyping up of Ohio State this offseason, but I think it's really easy to forget just how much work Oregon did. I think Ohio State had the most impressive offseason in the country, but Oregon's a close second and may have an argument too, because, they've completely revamped this roster and it's kind of weird with what they lost that we feel probably even better about this team going into 2024 than we did last year.
If you want a bolder take for this, Oregon being a playoff lock is really lukewarm. Locks are always lukewarm takes. If you want a bolder take about this, based on the pattern of this offseason in the last 2 years, I don't think he's my number 1 pick, but I think it's an incredibly real chance that not enough people are taking seriously that we look up in 5 years and Dan Lanning is the dude who runs college football the best.
Yeah.
I think there's a very real chance that he adjusts to this era better than anybody else.
Yeah.
And I think that has told me. Yeah.
I think that's totally valid. I could totally see that being true. I mean, obviously he's going to have to contend with his mentor in Kirby, but I think he's well on his way to being right up there in the mix with those names. And I'll kind of just drop my one because I did go with the more obvious one, but I think a lot of the same logic for me here applies with your pick. I've got Ohio State. And again, the main reason I just think they're a lock is because, and this really holds true, I could make this exact same case for Georgia too if I wanted to. Like,
Yeah.
I think maybe a little bit less effectively because Georgia's got a pretty brutal schedule themselves. But I think, when you look at teams from the Big Ten and SEC, like you said for Oregon, Ohio State doesn't have to win this conference anymore. Like, they don't have to be perfect. Like, they could be 10-2. I think they're pushing for a bid at 9-3 if that were to somehow happen. So I think it's kind of the same logic here. I think we just both are. I think I feel the same way about both of these teams, that they're just going to be too good, that there's like, I don't see any way there's like an 8-4 drop off. And that's probably what it's going to take for them not to be featured in the postseason.
Yeah. The Big Ten was really fascinating. This new era of the Big Ten was really fascinating when it looked like Lincoln Riley was going to like more replicate what he did at Oklahoma and when Kalen DeBoer was still at Washington. But now I think USC, I wouldn't bet on it. They're, spoiler alert, USC is not in my 12-team bracket. I think there's a reality in which USC is one of the 12 best teams in football later this year. I don't think it's a very likely one, but like outside of like a real bounce back campaign from Lincoln Riley and like a borderline Heisman season from Miller Moss, it's really just 14. Like the drama in the Big Ten is who gets the bye. It's Ohio State, Michigan, Penn State, and Oregon are kind of all fighting each other for the Big Ten Conference Championship. I have a hard time imagining any of the four of them missing the bracket entirely. I mean, we'll talk. We've a few we could talk about. I think Penn State and Michigan have questions, but I think the most likely outcome is all four of them making it.
Yeah, we'll get into it a little bit more further down the line, but I think one of those four may not be quite like the other, at least in my opinion. But yeah, I think that's pretty straightforward with both these teams. Like, I think we just way too high on them to see them disappointing like that this year, to the extent that it would take for them to miss the playoff. But we've already compiled our 12-team brackets, and I'm curious, who do you have? Like, who is your sleeper pick? Who do you think is the one, like, of all the teams in your 12, who is the one that would most surprise people? And I think there's a pretty clear choice here.
Yeah, there is. So when I first set up my 12-team bracket, it was pretty chalky. I'm not going to lie. There was one team that I had initially in here in this spot that I can say later that I eventually replaced with my sleeper pick. Because when you look back at the rankings in the college football playoff era, there's always a team that nobody saw coming in the top 10 by the end of the year. And obviously, it may be a little bit different with 12 now being the barometer instead of 4. But you look at the Kenny Pickett Pittsburgh season, or Missouri last year, or any number of options where a team just kind of comes out of nowhere with a absolute ceiling season. And now that the bar for that is the committee thinks you're a top 10 team instead of the committee thinks you can beat Georgia, I think is a very real chance that a team like that sneaks in here. I think that team is Virginia Tech, and I pop them in as my 10 seed. There's a lot of projection here, and I think I've been pretty vocal about being high on their quarterback, Kyron Drones, a former Baylor guy. Last year, he came in 3 or 4 games into the season, kind of got his feet under him a little bit, and then he threw for 15 touchdowns, ran for 4 more, and only threw 3 picks in like 8 games as the starter. So a 19-3 touchdown and like total touchdown to interception ratio. Threw for about 2,500 yards, ran for like 600 more, I believe. Let me double check that. Threw for 1,993 yards, ran for 642. I rounded to the wrong numeral 500. But a guy who puts up video game numbers and has a very, very difficult build to stop in college football, and a build that we've seen kind of run college football before, as a guy who's like notably taller than 6 feet tall. He's 6'2", 230 pounds, really fast, just kind of fits the mold of the quarterback that is kind of an unstoppable dual threat. He's decently accurate to all areas of the field. There are genuine questions about this. I will be the first one to say that. He played horrendously against Louisville and Virginia and Florida State, who were the 2 best defenses he played. Really the only 2 elite defenses he played. He was well below average. I think he averaged less than 5 yards an attempt. But that was also his first year as a starter. And I think it's very reasonable to think that he could be a guy who takes a leap forward now that he's got a full offseason under his belt. He was the backup going to last year's camp, so he wasn't getting reps with the ones. But every year that a team bucks, like I'm saying, like someone's going to make the playoff that is not among the 12 highest listed favorites, and they're going to need some kind of like Heisman finalist caliber season. And whether it's a guy like Nico Amaliva at Tennessee, who's another great candidate for this, I think it's Kyron Jones at Virginia Tech.
Yeah, so I'm not with you on the pick, to be honest with you, like the college football playoff pick, but I am, I think, with you on the sentiment with this team.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I think they are poised to take a pretty big leap this year. Had a quietly pretty nice 7-6 season last year, which pretty nice step forward from, I believe they were 3-9 in 2022 in Brent Pry's first season, which I think that was his first season. But yeah, I mean, I think, when you think about this team, at least when I think about this team, a lot of my mind goes straight to Kyron Jones, like you talked about. But I actually was surprised in kind of doing some research for this episode. Like, they return a lot of production on offense, even outside of Kyron Jones. I believe they return their leading rusher and top 2 receivers. They also bring back a 9.5 sack guy and Antoine Powell last year, a Florida transfer who was really, really good for them.
Ireland. Yeah.
Yeah. So like they've got some guys. I think they will make some noise in the ACC this year. I'll just be straight up now. A little teaser. I don't have any. I only have one ACC team in my field. I think that this league, with the way that it's at, the state of the league right now, I think they're going to struggle to get a second team in if that second team isn't like 11-1. Like, I don't think 10-2 is gonna cut it. At least this year.
I think the two best options for that for the conference, the best option for the conference to me, because I agree with you. The team I had in initially was Miami. Sorry, Hurricanes fans. And I swapped them for Virginia Tech for the entire argument that I couldn't see 3 ACC teams making it. I think the only argument that a non-conference champion in the ACC could make it is if they have a player who gains national attention for their play and goes 10-2. Like if they have a Heisman finalist and they go 10-2 and lose the conference championship or something. And I think the only 2 players capable of doing that are Kyron Jones and Cam Ward.
Yeah. And I'm glad you brought up Miami, because Miami, I thought about Miami. I kind of debated it, but my thing with Miami, if you look at their schedule, it is not bad at all. But because of that, I literally don't think you can justify putting that team in if they're not 12-1. Just because what will they have to show for it if that's not the case? So that was kind of my hang up with them. But I kind of generally, I understand where you're coming from with the pick. To be honest, if I had to pick a team that's going to make that kind of leap this year, it'd probably be NC State from the conference.
That was another one. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But I'm with you. I think they're going to have a really nice year. I think the trajectory with Brent Pry is pretty good. And I think they're going to have, I don't think they're going to have a CFP year, but I think they're going to have the kind of year that, you go into 2025, hey, maybe we're going to make a run to win this conference. So I think that's where they'll be at. But for me, I'm going with a little bit.
If you asked me this morning, I would have said Virginia Tech probably goes 8-4, maybe a really, really spunky 9-3. But as I was sitting there and as I was looking through the old top 12s in the college football playoff era, I was there's always one team that you think is going to do that just overperforms and they just check the boxes. So I agree with you in a vacuum, but for the sake of argument, I'm throwing them in.
Yeah. And I mean, that's probably good that you did that, because looking at mine, I really didn't have any obvious sleepers. And the one I went with ultimately is not really much of a sleeper, considering they're in playoff position in the preseason polls. But it is a team that I don't think is necessarily getting a ton of offseason attention, which is Missouri. Coming off one of the best seasons they've had since joining the SEC. And I think Eli Drinkwitz is doing a really nice job. I mean, they had a great year, and then just the way they're acquiring talent, both recruiting and through the transfer portal. It's really hard to not like the trajectory there, even though, you do kind of question where they stand in this new SEC. Are they closer to the upper half? Are they more in that tier with a South Carolina and Arkansas? I don't think we know the answer to that question yet, but regardless, I think this year's team is set to be very, very good again. Returning almost their whole offense. The biggest thing they're losing is running back Cody Schrader, who was very good, but they replaced him with Marcus Carroll, who was a more than 1,300 yard rusher at Georgia State last season. So as far as, replacements go, you can't get much more proven than that. And they've portaled really well on defense again after losing some guys like Tyron Hopper. So I think they're going to be good. I think I've seen people predict them to make the playoffs, but I feel I've seen other teams like LSU, for example, kind of get the rub over them. And I don't buy that, to be honest. I'm not that high on LSU going into this year. I'm not high on teams like Tennessee or Texas A&M or anything like that either. I think if you're looking to get a fifth team from the SEC, in which I have 5, which probably Like that seems ridiculous. Like I'm like, there's no way they're going to get 5, but
I think
like,
5 might be the floor.
yeah, like so.
Yeah.
If there's gonna be another SEC team in there near the bottom, which is where I have them, I think it's gonna be Missouri. And I like them. I like their outlook this year quite a bit.
Yeah, I think it's a great choice. I think there's a little bit of hiding in plain sight with Missouri of like I think everybody knows they're a playoff caliber roster, but like smaller school, smaller fan base, like no one really kind of wants to pick Missouri. And I hate to say it, but I think it's really just boredom. I think people are like, I'm not really super like I'd rather see Tennessee or LSU in the playoffs, so I'm going to pick
Mm-hmm.
them instead. And I just don't think that's like I think there's a very real scenario where Missouri is like I don't know if they'll make the SEC championship game or make a push for it, but I have much more faith in them making that push than a couple of the other teams you listed.
And they also, for what it's worth, like as far as schedules go in the new SEC, theirs is about as easy as it can possibly get.
Hmm.
And other than a weird, they go to UMass in October, which is kind of weird, but still shouldn't be a tough game. That's just weird.
No,
Um,
yeah, that's just strange. Yeah.
yeah. But I think another interesting discussion, and this is kind of a callback to what we were talking about earlier. You know, who do we think, like, who is everyone talking about that's as a playoff team that we don't think is going to make it? And I'll just lead off here. I'll go back to what you were talking about earlier. I don't think Michigan is a playoff team this year. I think looking at the preseason AP top 25, which came out on Monday, I think they are the team that's being like easily the team that's being most overvalued coming into the season. I don't really see it at all here, to be honest with you. Like with
Sure.
everything they lost, what do you guys have?
I was about to say, I couch this? The reason I didn't pick Michigan is because I was looking at the general vibes, like between off-season investigations from the NCAA and coming in ninth. I was like, I don't think this is a big enough team for me to call my like surprise miss. Like,
Yeah,
not to
and maybe
not to dump on the parade, but like that was like
yeah.
Michigan was my first thought too, and I was like, this like kind of feels easy.
Well, yeah, and I left them off my ballot, and like that doesn't like that wouldn't surprise me. Like I don't think that's surprising, but I mean, obviously, the way they're being prognosticated preseason, like it would surprise quite a few people because they're being mocked, being projected as a team that's going to be that good. But I just don't get it, man. Like they lost so much. They had 15 guys drafted, I think. The quarterback situation here, like between Alex Orji and Jack Tuttle, I don't think you feel great about either of those guys. Um, and obviously Harbaugh leaving, but then you also lose your defensive coordinator too, who was so key to everything that they've been able to do the last couple of years. Like I'm not even anti Sharon Moore. I think they'll probably be fine in the long term with Sharon Moore. I just this year, like you went all in to win the national title last year, and now that team is pretty much gone. Like this is going to be a rebuilding year, and even in the Big Ten, where your margin for error is a lot bigger than it is in a lot of other conferences, I don't think it's going to be that big. And I think there's going to be other teams in this league that are just better than them.
So I agree with everything you just said. Couldn't agree more, actually. For sake of being lame, I said what I said earlier, and I still had Michigan in my bracket.
Mm-hmm.
But that was mostly because of what we were talking about earlier with Big Ten. I think they're only going to potentially lose to playoff teams, and they're still going to have the bump of being last year's champions.
Mm-hmm.
But I agree with you. I think that there's just a very bad feeling about it all. And what you were saying, like the only thing I want to add is, like you said, you think they're going to be fine with Sharon Moore. I think they would hypothetically be fine with Sharon Moore, but I think Sharon Moore is really being set up as a fall guy, very, very, very transparently, and it's a little irritating. Even as someone who's like doesn't really have much of a stake in Sharon Moore, he's taking over a program that like behind a storied head coach who won the school's like long awaited first national championship in decades. So the expectations are finally back. They've beaten their biggest rival 3 years in a row, their biggest rival who are still playoff contenders and were playoff contenders all of those seasons. You're coming in with NCAA investigations that are probably going to affect your tenure with the program. And you lost a very, very competent quarterback and a lot of like high end NFL talent, especially along the lines of scrimmage and on the perimeter. And like, yeah, you still have Will Johnson, you still have Mason Graham, but there's a very real chance that Michigan goes 9-3, sneaks in as an at-large this year, goes 8-4 or 7-5 next year, just because everything is looming over them. Even if Sharon Moore is like still a good coach who could take over a Power Four program in the long run, and they just cut bait. Like he might end up being the guy where they're like, we need to fire somebody, because
Yeah.
of what's going on right now, and it just ends up being him, and that stinks because I don't think he really deserves that. But
Yeah, I mean, I could see that. Like, I think maybe there's a chance they're hedging in that way. Like they know that this is kind of the potential out they have if this doesn't go the way they think. But I mean, he earned this job. Like
no,
he
100%.
coached half the season when they won the national title and beat Ohio State. I think there's, I don't think it was just a like. I don't think he was. I guess what I'm trying to say is I don't think he was brought in as like a transitional head
Oh,
coach.
I agree. He earned the job 100%.
Yeah,
He put forth an effort last year as the offensive coordinator and as the interim head coach that made them say no to him. Like he had to come to he earned this job to the point where not only was he the number one name on the list, they couldn't justify hiring anybody else instead of him. It was
I don't even
incredibly
think they
impressive.
tried to. It doesn't sound like they even like
No,
interviewed anybody else or
no,
anything.
because
Yeah,
I don't think they could justify looking outside
yeah,
when they had an option that good.
yeah.
However, I'm more so looking forward of like who's going to be holding the beanbag when the music stops a little bit. Who's going to be
Yeah, I mean,
left
I
without
think
a
it's
chair?
possible.
Who's going to be left without a chair when the NCAA decides that you get, however, like I don't think they're actually going to do anything, which we said in another podcast. But if the NCAA comes in and is like, I don't know, like 2-year bowl ban or something, which would be unprecedented and that'd be
Yeah, that'd
insane.
be
But like
crazy.
yeah, I don't think it actually happens. But if some consequences come down on the NCAA, if the investigations affect their recruiting somehow, if the team like Michigan before when Harbaugh got there, 8-4 was fine, and they like 8-4 with potential was fine. It's not fine anymore, and
Mhm.
it's a brutal job. It's going to be a very brutal job.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's all fair. I mean, like I think at the end of the day, though, they've got that national title, and I know that wasn't Sharon Moore technically, but I think he's still going to kind of get the honeymoon that comes from that still. And I mean, at the end of the day, like this was a program that kind of struggled for relevancy for a while. And they're back there at least for now. I mean, obviously, I think 3 years of not being there, if the NCAA decides to do some sort of like death rattle show of strength right here at the end, then like, yeah, maybe. But we'll just kind of have to see how it plays out there. But I want to get into yours because yours legitimately surprised me. Like I was not expecting that you would leave this team out.
Yeah, I do not think the Texas Longhorns make the college football playoff. I think it's a combination of they just lost, I believe Christian Clark, I think is his name, another running back to who's tore his Achilles. It's 2 season-ending injuries in the running back room. You lost 2 phenomenal defensive tackles last year. You lost 2 first-round wide receiver talents. I know Adonai Mitchell didn't go until the second round, but 2 first-round talents with him and Xavier Worthy. You lost Jonathan Brooks. And a lot of this ties back to my priors on Steve Sarkisian and my priors on Quinn Ewers. And I think that after last year, there was an embarrassment of riches, both along the defensive line and on the offense, that asked the two of them to exemplify their teammates' strengths rather than carry the wheelbarrow. And I think that the Texas mold in 2024, whether it be because of team building or whether it be because of the expectations now heaped upon those two, I think the expectation in Texas is that those two are going to carry the wheelbarrow, and I don't trust it. I don't trust it. I can't see it. I think there were a lot of big plays left on the board for that offense from Quinn Ewers, either not quite having his timing down on deep routes or not quite having his distance control down on his throws. And frankly, we just have a large sample size of Steve Sarkisian running offenses with expectations that I just don't necessarily think it's going to be a finely tuned machine without a litany of top end talent everywhere. And I know they got Isaiah Bond in the transfer portal, but I think obviously the play against Auburn was heroic, but I think he was inconsistent enough and played second fiddle I think he played very well he played a great second fiddle to Jermaine Burton. But I don't know if the Alabama offense runs through Isaiah Bond if Burton's not stretching the field. I think it's going to be a litmus test for all 3 of them, and I think all 3 of them need to pass. I will say to credit for all the arguments we were making earlier, Texas could probably go with their reputation as a program, what happened last year, and everything else going on, and the amount of at-large bids. Texas could probably go 9-3 and still make the playoff. But this schedule is tough, not just because it's the SEC. They play Michigan out of conference. They're gonna have to play Oklahoma. They're gonna have to play Georgia, Florida, Texas A&M. Like, I don't necessarily think those last two teams, especially, are like notable, but that's like A&M's a rivalry game. That's the first time it's being played in a long time. Oklahoma is like very impressive program. I think Venables in the rivalry game could always prove imposing. And then Georgia and Michigan are going to be two top end defenses that forced a lot of quarterbacks to expose their flaws last year. And I just think that betting on a team where two of Sarkisian, Ewers, and Isaiah Bond have to overperform for me is just like rising a red flag that I can't shake.
So I think I'm kind of on the same page as you when it comes to Quinn Ewers. I have my misgivings about him also, but I do think he proved last year that he can be good enough to at least get them there when there's talent around him. I'm a little curious, like, what are your priors about Steve Sarkisian? Because I kind of think, I think he's proven himself as a recruiter for sure. And I think last season proved that he's one of the best offensive minds in the sport. I mean, the way they torched that Alabama defense that we later found out was pretty elite. Like, I'm curious where you're coming from there.
That's true. I might be being a little overly harsh on his early years with this program just because it's Texas. The expectations are always unreasonably high. They're going to be ranked in the preseason top 25 no matter what. But I think until last year, to me, this is probably a little unfair given what the talent on the field actually was. But comparing preseason to results, it felt a little like we were waiting for something to happen with Sarkisian that couldn't. And part of that was, I think that it was still a couple years away from becoming his team. But I think when I watched the Texas teams prior to having a Xavier Worthy and Adonai Mitchell on the outside, the schematic work was impressive, but I don't think it really elevated that team. And I think I should say, I think Sarkisian's a very good offensive play caller. I think he's a very good schemer. I was perhaps a little overly harsh getting caught up in that. But I think that he's great at accessing talent and he's great at showing off talent. I haven't seen him in many situations where he's had to elevate talent to me and like really, really shown up. And this is like a long time to look, like there's a long history here to look back, and I'm sure there are examples that prove me wrong. And this might be the take that age is the worst that I have on this podcast. But the times when he's looked most impressive as an offensive coordinator were his Bama stint and last year at Texas. And those were times where he was littered with first round talent. And I just don't know if he has that same first round talent. So I should say, I apologize to Steve Sarkisian, being a little overly harsh there. I think in order, my concerns are Quinn Ewers, how much worse the wide receiver, tight end, and running back rooms are compared to last year, and then Steve Sarkisian. I think my issues with Steve are less, I think that he will hold this team back, and more so, if you lose that many first rounders, do I think Sarkisian rights the ship back to a 10-11 win team? I don't know if I've seen him do that in Austin yet.
Yeah, I think those are mostly fair points. I have them in my field. I'm pretty high on this team. I got maybe a little bit less high on them with the CJ Baxter injury because that's just another question mark on an offense that already had a few of them. But it doesn't fundamentally change the fact that I think this is one of the 3 or 4 best teams in the SEC. And if you're one of the 3 or 4 best teams in the SEC, I think your odds of being in the CFP are pretty good. But now we're going to talk about we've talked about teams who maybe aren't expecting it, could make a jump, teams that, we think are very likely to do that. But who are the teams that have to do it? Like which teams do we see as teams that can't afford to miss the playoff this season? I'll start this one off. I've got a guy who really can't afford to miss it. It's James Franklin. We got to get this done at some point. James Franklin and Penn State, we got to get this done. They've had way too many seasons that they go into with playoff expectations, and they have a good year, but they lose the most important games on the schedule, and it's enough to cost them a spot in the playoff. Now, as we talked about with Ohio State and Oregon, you do not have to be perfect anymore. You do not even have to win this conference. And they don't play Oregon. They don't play Michigan. So they've got Ohio State and they've got Washington and USC. So there's like some tough games here, but like to me, you just got to get the job done. I know there's 2 new coordinators here, but I think, at least offensively, I think they upgraded. We'll see about the defensive side of the ball. I think Manny Diaz was a pretty significant loss, but like this team is talented enough that like they should be, to me, the 3rd best team, at least like the 3rd or 4th best team in the Big Ten. And again, like with Texas, when you're that good, you've got to make it. But like, unlike Texas, there is significant pressure here because they've just underachieved one too many times. And I think James Franklin will find himself under some pressure if they do it again.
Yeah, no, I think that's perfect. I think we had our James Franklin conversation in the hot seat episode. So if anyone hasn't tuned into that one, that's another incredible conversation to have about James Franklin. But I think everything you just said is right. I think this is the prove it year on the contract for James Franklin. If you can't do this, when are you going to do it?
Yeah.
And I think on that, sorry.
No, you can go ahead and lead. I was going to say yours is kind of, I think, a pretty similar situation.
I think the program that I have is this year going poorly away from having the exact reputation that Franklin has now. I think he's been at the job a little too, hasn't quite been in the job long enough to have the reputation Franklin has. But if Lane Kiffin does not make the playoffs this year with Ole Miss, when are we going to do it? You absolutely killed it in the transfer portal. You have Jackson Dart back. You have you got Walter Nolan, star defensive tackle, one of the best recruits of the last few years. You snagged him from Texas A&M. You got Juice Wells, the South Carolina receiver, who was an all-SEC first-team guy the last time he was healthy. And on their schedule, you have Georgia later in the year. That's going to be brutal. But the only 2 other preseason teams ranked in the preseason top 25 are LSU and Oklahoma. And both of those, I think we both agree, are a clear tier, if not multiple tiers below playoff contention.
Certainly so for Oklahoma. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so Lane Kiffin, another guy who offensive mastermind, that's his entire reputation, and has kind of come in the last few years in a row with everyone questioning whether he finally has enough talent to make the leap as a schemer and kind of take this team and run and announce Ole Miss as a big presence in the SEC. And it just hasn't happened, but they've consistently finished in New Year's 6 contention. They've consistently been 8th, 9th, 10th, somewhere in that range. Again, a lot like James Franklin. And now you have the most talent you've ever had. They're the best transfer portal class by a wide margin, and you only play one true college football playoff contender team. You can make the playoff 11-1 with a loss to Georgia. You can probably make the playoff 10-2 with a loss to Georgia in the SEC. If you lose 3 games with this schedule and the talent you brought in, when is this going to happen? What are we waiting for?
Yeah, I totally agree. The only area where I would maybe push back a little bit is that I think if Ole Miss were to disappoint this year, were to miss the CFP, honestly, I think it would reflect a little bit more about Ole Miss than it would about Kiffin. Maybe it would make me think less of Kiffin, but I think more than anything, it would make me think I don't know if this can be done at Ole Miss. They're acquiring talent at a historical level right now. It's hard to imagine they could really do it any better than they are. And they're, putting a lot of resources. Their NIL situation's pretty solid for what their program is. If you're not able to do it with this coach and this situation and the talent on the roster, I just don't I've been excluding Ole Miss from that tier of the Arkansas, the South Carolinas, whatever. I'll start to wonder if maybe we're just seeing a high end version of one of those programs, though, if they can't get over the hump this year.
That's exceptionally fair. I wasn't trying to say that's how I would feel about Lane Kiffin. Mm-hmm. That is what the conversation about Lane Kiffin will become if they go 9-3 this year. Right, wrong, or indifferent on a national scale. And I kind of agree. I think the end result of that is Lane Kiffin going to another job, because I think that's the conversation Lane Kiffin's going to have with himself. I agree with you in a vacuum that I think that this upcoming year that we're about to see is the ceiling of what you can accomplish with Ole Miss's resources. However, I do think Lane Kiffin found a way between the transfer portal and his recruiting. I do think he found a way to get enough talent that I think this is possible. So I agree with you that it's probably more reflective of Ole Miss than Kiffin if this goes poorly. I think there's enough talent in the building to think that a 9-3, 8-4 season says something about Kiffin. It says more about Ole Miss. I agree with you, but it says something about Kiffin.
Yeah, and I think that's fair considering that both of us ultimately did put them in our projected field, and not even that close to the bottom either. So I think without further ado, that's a good time to just go ahead and get into this. We'll break our brackets down. So I'll start this off and just kind of running through it. I won't get too lost in the weeds on any of these in particular, but I've got Ohio State number one. The schedule is tough. Like I think it is fair to question, will they have a good enough regular season to be in this position? I'm just so high on this roster. I think they're going to be really good this year. I think, and then beyond them, obviously these top four are guaranteed to go to conference champions. I've got Georgia at number two. I think they're going to be right up in that mix too throughout the regular season. I think, with Carson Beck, even losing guys like Brock Bowers and Lyle McConkey, I think they're still going to be a pretty good team again this year, probably going to be making a deep CFP run. And then beyond that, it gets a little weirder. So at three, I've got Utah, who's my Big 12 champion. I think they come in, compete pretty easily. I think, there's good teams in this conference, but I don't think there's anyone that's clearly established themselves the way Utah has in the last few years. Going after that, I've got Florida State, my only ACC team, my projected ACC champion. Not that high on them. I think they're going to take a step back, but I think the roster is still good enough to win that conference this year. And then that's where things get interesting with the at-larges. And we've already talked about some of these teams, so I won't, talk too much about it now. But I have Oregon number 5. I think they're just on the outside looking in. I could see them winning the Big Ten pretty easily, but I'll stick with Ohio State for now. After that, at number 6, I've got Texas, who I do think makes the playoff. I see them personally as the second best team in the SEC still, behind Georgia. And I think they might be closer to Georgia than some other teams are to them.
Can I couch my Sark take? Because now it's starting to bother me that I phrased it so poorly. I kind of just word vomited. My Steve Sarkisian take. I think Steve Sarkisian's a very good coach. I don't think he's in the top 5 coach in the country tier. I think I have him a half step below that. I think that's the bar that I think sneaky he might have to clear with this Texas roster. Okay, continue.
Yeah, you're sorry.
Good. I just bothering me that I didn't phrase that right.
Yeah, no, you're good. That'll take us to number 7, though, which is I think another guy who maybe is in that mix, but I think still has quite a bit to prove in Kalen DeBoer in Alabama. I think they're going to be solid this year. I have questions about the long-term trajectory, but I think this roster is good enough to get in this field. I see this as more of a 10-2 kind of team. I don't see this as necessarily a team that's poised to make a deep run. And we'll just have to see how the Alabama fan base takes a season like that. I'm not sure if that will be seen as a success, but regardless, I think they will find themselves in this mix when it's all said and done. After that, I've got not for the faint of heart. Following up Nick Saban at Alabama, but no, I've got Ole Miss getting in at number 9 for pretty much all the reasons we just talked about. I think the roster is good enough to get over the hump. At number 10, I've got a team that we haven't talked about, but both of us do think makes the playoff in Notre Dame. Kind of haven't talked about them a ton this offseason, but I think there's reason to like them. I like Marcus Freeman a lot. I think they've had some very unfortunate luck in his first couple campaigns. I think that luck is going to turn at some point. I think this team could be the one to do it. And then to finish things off, I've got Missouri at number 11. Again, a team that may be surprising, but I think they're going to have a nice year. And then at number 12, I'll talk about this one for a second because it's interesting. I've got Boise getting the group of 5 New Year's 6. And my reasoning for that, I was debating between them and Memphis. And my reasoning for going Boise is I just think they have the more opportunities to improve their resume when you look at their schedule. Like obviously, like you mentioned earlier in the show, they have that game at Oregon in week 2, I believe. Probably not going to win that game. I mean, obviously, if you do, then these conversations ramp up significantly. But even if you don't, you've still got Washington State and Oregon State later on the schedule. Technically not power programs, but power program adjacent. I think games that would both be seen as pretty good wins if you get them, in addition to having a nice run in the Mountain West. So like Memphis' only tough game, I believe, is against Florida State, and they could win that game. So like, obviously then that would put them in a great spot. But I think assuming they don't win it, it's hard for me to imagine that Memphis has the resume to beat out like an 11-1 Boise.
Yeah, no, I'll go ahead and get into mine, but we have a lot of similarities. I did flip Georgia and Ohio State at the top. I think that despite both of us being pretty high on the Buckeyes overall, I think Kirby Smart is coming back in this regular season with something to prove. I think he feels like he left the national championship on the just sitting there on the table last year, and I think that is going to be a theme throughout the entire regular season with that Georgia team. I think they are a tier above everybody else in the SEC. Georgia and Ohio State. I also have Utah 3 and Florida State 4. I think we're kind of on the same page about Florida State right now, which is a team that very reasonably could take a step back entirely out of playoff contention. But I don't see how, between Mike Norvell's resume the last 2 years and the state of the rest of the ACC, I can't comfortably pick somebody else to win that conference and feel good about it. But you took everything I was going to say about Utah. I also had Oregon 5th. I had Alabama 6th. I had Notre Dame 7th. So I'm a little higher on them. I agree with everything you said about Marcus Freeman. I think Riley Leonard, while having flaws at Duke, is a quarterback capable of executing to a higher degree than anybody they've had healthy in the Marcus Freeman era. I think very sneakily, Marcus Freeman has put together impressive campaigns while kind of having to play around his quarterback play, mostly through injury luck and other things. But a lot of games with second, third string quarterbacks for him. So if Riley Leonard can stay healthy, I think that's going to be more of a game changer than people think for that program. I have Ole Miss 8th and Penn State 9th. So I have those two back to back, both making it. I have Virginia Tech 10th. I have Michigan 11th. And then at 12 for me, I'll take a little time to talk about this. I have the Liberty Flames making the playoff. And I think it's less because I think they're a better football team than Memphis or a couple of teams we talked about in the American or Boise, and more because I think there's a very real chance that Liberty watches the Mountain West and the American kind of cannibalize itself. And I think Memphis could be a very good team, more deserving of that 12 spot than Liberty would be on paper, or if they played each other head to head and still go 9-3 or 10-2. And I don't know who Liberty loses to on their schedule. In fact, I don't know who really gives Liberty a very good game. And in the past, we've seen the committee hold that against them a little bit and kind of keep them around the 20 mark in the rankings. But with the increase of talent in the SEC and the Big Ten and how much those teams are going to be playing each other, and while there are teams that I feel good about betting on, like Memphis and like Tulane in the American, I don't necessarily feel good about betting on them to reach 11 wins. And I don't know if a 10-2 conference champion from the American or a 10-2 conference champion from the Mountain West beats out an undefeated CUSA champion, even if it's a weaker conference. So I think I'm picking Liberty less because I think they're going to be the best group of 5 team, and more so because I think there's a case at the end of the year where everyone's like, well, they're undefeated.
Yeah, I think that's very possible, especially because I think it's hard to see an undefeated American champion or an undefeated Boise with the schedules they've got. So I do think Liberty, if they run the table, will probably have a really good argument. I just think they're going to have to run the table.
I agree. If they lose, they're completely out of it. But I don't know who that loss is to. Maybe Appalachian State. I don't know who that loss is to.
Yeah, I mean, that's fair. That's totally fair.
But
yeah. But let's go ahead and get into our round by round predictions. We can kind of knock these out, but I'll let you start off. Who do you have in the first round, the on-campus games? Who do you have winning in those matchups?
Yeah, so I shockingly only have one upset in this, and it is in the most neutral game possible. So I have Oregon beating Liberty. I have, and not to be mean, but I feel like that game might look like the bowl game last year. I have Alabama beating Michigan. I have Notre Dame beating Virginia Tech pretty comfortably. Speaking Alabama, Oregon, and Notre Dame, speaking of 3 very cool sites to host an on-campus game. I think Penn State goes into Oxford and beats Ole Miss.
Interesting. So we both have that Penn State Ole Miss matchup in ours. Mine is flipped. I have that game being in Happy Valley. But so I actually have 2
Ole Miss doesn't have a chance if it's in Happy Valley. I don't.
Well, I picked them. Yeah, I picked them. So I've got 2 seed upsets in mind. I've got Oregon beating Boise in what would be a rematch. That would actually be a really interesting 5-12 game. But I have Texas beating Missouri. I think chalk holds there pretty easily. I have Notre Dame upsetting Alabama too.
Ooh,
when I told you when I said that I don't think this is an Alabama team poised to make a run, that's how I feel about it. I think they're good enough to get there, But I think if they ran into a team that plays the way that Notre Dame does, I could easily see that game going poorly for them. And then I do have Ole Miss. I think Ole Miss's brand of football, assuming it's not like just ice bowl type conditions at Penn State, I think they'll probably be able to win that game.
Yeah. Right bet on Drew Aller in the college football postseason on my tombstone.
Yeah.
But no, I think that talking about, we're going to fly by this conversation for a longer day, but I think if Liberty sneaks in as the 12 seed, I think we're going to have some really unfun discourse on social media about whether the group of 5 really deserves a playoff spot. Because I think Liberty's entire argument is going to be we're undefeated and the other teams aren't. Yeah. I think they are going to get shellacked if they go.
Much worse than any of the other contenders would have,
yes,
probably.
Absolutely. Yeah. So our quarterfinal games. I'll let you go first. You let me go first last time.
Yeah, I'll lead this one. So I've got Ohio State beating Ole Miss. They're my top seed. I think Ole Miss is good, but I don't think they're good enough to win a game like that. I've got Georgia beating Notre Dame. Again, I think this is just I like this Notre Dame team. I don't love Alabama, but I think Georgia is going to be just on another level. I actually have Texas upsetting Utah here. I like Utah. But I don't. I guess that's a seed upset. They would probably be like a touchdown favorite in that game.
Yeah.
But I agree. Like I think the Texas at least gets that win in round 2 against Utah, and then I also have Oregon upsetting FSU, again same sort of thing. Like this would probably be a 10-point spread or something like that, but technically seed upset, and I really like Oregon.
Yeah. So I have the same. 4 results, I guess. And we both have the same top 4 teams in different order for Georgia Ohio State. I had Georgia beating Penn State. I had Ohio State beating Notre Dame. I had Oregon beating Florida State pretty comfortably. And I had Alabama beating Utah. And I came into this feeling the same way you felt about Alabama. But when I went through the bracket, they drew this Michigan team, which we both had the exact same feelings about, even though I had them in the bracket and you didn't. And they drew this Utah team, who I think is clearly the best team in the Big 12, but would clearly be like the 6th or 7th best team in the SEC. So did not expect to have Alabama in the semifinals. I kind of agree with you, but based on the way that my bracket went out, based on the seeds that I thought they'd had, they kind of got a pretty favorable draw.
Yeah, no, I think that's totally fair. But now looking at the semis, what do you got? What's your national title game?
Do we have the same 2 in the national title game? I have Georgia and Ohio State. Yeah, I have Georgia versus Ohio State. Yeah, I think betting on Ryan Day is a fool's errand, but I think we're on a bit of a crash course for these 2.
The only thing I want to say real quick about my semi matchups is that I just think they're interesting because I have Ohio State over Oregon and Georgia over Texas, which I think feasibly could be the 3rd time we see both of those matchups this year.
Yeah.
They each play during the regular season. I think there's a good chance those are the Big Ten and SEC championship matchups, and then you could see them again in the playoff.
Yeah, I think my semi matchups are also interesting. I have Georgia, Oregon, so Dan Lanning trying to get the better of his old mentor, and then Ohio State, Alabama as a rematch of that like embarrassing 2020 national championship game. So I think those are not quite as interesting as yours. That'd be really cool. Just like cool and also a reflection of the current state of college football. But we'll get to that conversation another day. But like if the semis are like a rubber match in like a in-conference rivalry, that would be interesting.
Yeah.
But and then I think we had the same result.
I think we do too. I think we're both going with the Buckeyes. I think they get it done for Ryan Day this year. Yeah, I mean, like we've talked about this a lot too, so there's no need to like reiterate too much, but I think we both think that Ryan Day is a really, really good football coach who's assembled a fantastic roster and coaching staff this offseason. Schedule's going to be tough, but they're my pick right now. There's no team that I think is as complete across the board as they are.
Yeah, I think the amount of talent they brought back from their defense is big. I think we talked earlier about how I felt like it was a miscalculation on Ryan Day's part to try and beat Michigan at their own game last year, but they also did so by bringing in a lot of exceptional defensive talent, especially along the trenches, and then a lot of those guys chose to stay, chiefly JT Tamulu. I'm sure I pronounced that wrong. I'm tired. I've been moving. That kind of came out as a bunch of letters. I'm just going to let it go. But a lot of defensive talent from last year they kept. And I think that combined with getting Quinshon Judkins in this offense, Jeremiah Smith, Ryan Day, kind of having the ghost of Harbaugh out from off his back in the Big Ten. It's going to be funny because I think Will Howard's a good quarterback. I think Will Howard's the worst quarterback they've had since before Justin Fields. And I don't think that's really an insult to Will Howard. I think they've had pretty much.
Do you count Kyle McCord in that?
No, he's better than Kyle McCord. I take that back. No, it says something about Kyle McCord that I completely forgot him in the math. So I take back that point. But yeah, no, I think that it's kind of lining up for. I think if Ohio State takes the right lessons from last year's season, I think that they are set up to excel offensively as they have every year in the Ryan Day tenure, while also having just enough good defensive talent to outlast Georgia.
Yep. So Ryan Day, no pressure, no pressure at all.
Yeah.
But I think that's going to
nothing at all.
No expectations, no pressure. Just go out and take it easy. Who cares what Lou Holtz thinks? But I think that's going to just about do it for our final episode of the offseason. When you hear back from us next week, we'll be previewing week 0. Kind of a bare week 0 slate, but you know what? Beggars can't be choosers. Football is football. We're excited for that. Check in with us next time. We'll see you then.